I have to be totally honest with you. I've been doing public speaking now for several years, and I usually I'm not nervous at all anymore before talks. But for some reason, I'm nervous at this one. Yeah, and I think it's because, I am not a scientist. And in the past few years, in some ways, I've been found in the particular position to have a lot of discussions and dialogues with scientists, cognitive scientists like John Vervaeke, Jordan Peterson, psychologists, but then also more recently, people that even talk about evolution or questions of complexity. And so I am exploring this world. I'm kind of discovering how it is that my love of and my love of the thinking, or the phronema, right, the way of thinking of the church and of the church fathers can help us understand our world, even, in relationship to science. And so one of the issues that we've had in the past few hundred years is that in some ways there's been a onslaught, like an attack upon the foundation text that we love, right? And so from the materialist point of view, there's been this attack on, for example, Genesis 1, where it's been ridiculed, it's been shown to be not scientific, that it's this strange old Bronze Age mythology that doesn't make any sense anymore. And one of my missions in life has been to help people look back at these texts, and not only that we shouldn't be ashamed of those texts, but there is a gold mine in these texts to help us understand the world, to help us understand complexity, and especially to help us understand the role of the human, or what we could call now in more modern terms, the role of consciousness especially self-consciousness, in that system, the way that we encounter reality. So what I want to do with you today is we're going to go through the image of the body as we see it in Scripture. From Genesis all through Scripture, the body is represented in certain ways that can help us understand not only the human body, but we have to understand body in a more general sense as the manner in which multiplicity or complexity is brought into unity. And that is the way it's presented in Scripture, and we're going to go through it and see how it has ramifications. And so when you see the title of my talk, which is The Body, a Symbol, or the symbol of the body, that is the etymology of the word symbol, by the way, right? And so when we talk about a symbol, we tend to think of it as just a referent, right? Something that represents something else, but that's not the right way to understand it, at least not in the context of this talk. We have to understand it more like when we talk about the symbol of the faith. Why do we say the symbol of the faith, the symbol of the apostles? It's rather the pulling in of multiple elements together, condensing them, right? Compressing them in a manner that makes us see its unity, that makes us see why it's together. The word symbol actually means etymologically two things that are thrown together. And so how do they, being two, also are perceived or are understood as one? And so the story in Genesis 1, the creation story, describes creation in a manner that I hope at this point everybody will understand is not a scientific description. It is not describing the world in a way that would be, let's say, acceptable to a biologist or to someone who is trying to predict phenomena or to reproduce phenomena in a lab. That is not what is being described. But nonetheless, it is not useless. It is very useful, because I think it is describing what we could call a meta-scientific process. What I mean by that is that I think that the text in Genesis 1 is describing the process of science as it looks at the world, the intermediary of consciousness, we could say, in the manner in which we're able to make sense and to analyze the world. And so what it does is that it places the human at the center. So in order to understand the text, we have to place the human at the center. If we don't do that, then the text makes no sense. Right? It describes what we could call a phenomenological approach to reality, which is it describes the world in a way that makes sense of how you experience the world every day. Because although I don't doubt the existence of black holes and of quasars and of all that stuff, those are not part of your everyday life. They don't manifest the world. And I don't doubt the fact that the earth turns around the sun. All of these things are technically useful to help you fly airplanes and to do all this stuff. But the reality of your world is that the sky is up and the earth is down, and the sun comes up in the east and it goes down in the west. And you ignore that to your peril, right? If you constantly convince yourself that that reality is an illusion, then you will run into many problems, right? Like, if we don't like the idea that the sun is the king, or the chief of the heavens, and we think that's a silly Bronze Age superstition, try living differently, right? And you will find that without the sun, everybody manages their day with the sun coming up in the morning and the sun going down at night. And that is never going away, right? It's like except for maybe the very, very few people that live on the space station or whatever, or go to the moon. For most of the time, for most of us, that's the world we live in. The sky is up, the earth is down, the earth is pretty flat. There's a little bit of that stuff most of the time, And we can say that it's round for good reason, like I said, to predict certain things. But most of the world, that's how it is. And that's the world that Genesis is describing. So once you kind of just accept that, then a lot of the problems will just go away. And you can read the text and understand what it is trying to set up. All right. And so it begins and says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, this is very beautiful. And Bishop Barron showed us yesterday Michelangelo's image and this idea of the possible idea that Michelangelo is representing a brain. The word in the beginning can be translated and has been translated by some as in the head, right? You could say heading, right? It's a good way to translate it. André Chouraki, who translated the Bible into French, he called it en tête, like in the head. And that notion, right, is also true for the Greek and arche, which also has that illusion of in the head. And so the notion of the body, right, the relationship of the head to creation, or the head to the body, is there right at the outset, in the very first description, the very first verse of the Bible, okay? And so we have these two terms, heaven and earth. Sorry, let me just get some water here. So these two terms, heaven and earth, God created heaven and earth. In some ways, they are, at the outset, empty terms, right? So God creates the heaven and earth, and then he gives one little characteristic to help us kind of understand what it is that we're referring to. And it says, the earth was formless and empty, formless and void. There's darkness over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God is hovering above the waters. And so there's a basic duality to the world. There's heaven and there's earth, and there's a little bit of characteristics that are given to us, which is that above is spirit, right? And below is unformed chaos, darkness, okay? Now, that structure will now start to be filled with characteristics to help you understand what it is we're talking about. Because the idea that the earth is formless and void, and that the Spirit of God hovers above the waters, that is not yet a phenomenological description. Like, that is not the created world yet, at least not in the way that we understand it. We have never, ever, I hope, experienced absolute formlessness. Like, we have never experienced absolute void. Right? That is not something that's part of our experience. You could also say that we've never experienced absolute spirit. So it's not clear yet what we mean by spirit, but as the text progresses, we're going to start to understand what it is that we're talking about when we say spirit. Because the heavens will be populated with certain things, right? God will create light, and then God will separate the light from the darkness. I mean, it's interesting because it repeats the pattern, right? So you have heaven, you have earth, and then you have light, and you have darkness. And we're already told that the darkness is already there at the beginning. So it's weird because, it's like, so you can see the structure is being filled with qualities. And the best way to understand those qualities is to understand that in the heavens are invisible things that make other things move, at least at the outset. Because what's one of the characteristics of wind? Spirit. When we say spirit, by the way, the word spirit just means wind. It's not a special word that, it comes to have very esoteric meanings later, but the word in the scripture, the word spirit, means wind. What's one of the characteristics of wind? One of the characteristics of wind is that you don't see it, but it makes other things move, right? What's the characteristics of light? You can't see light, but light makes other things visible, okay? And so if you want to understand what heaven is, and I'm talking about this all through the Bible, everywhere where it talks about heaven, that's what it's talking about. It's talking about what is described here in Genesis 1, which is that which makes other things move, right? And so that's why, like when we started with en tête, or in the head, or heading, right? We understand that. And so then it becomes relativized all through the text, because let's say a king, he's not invisible, he's visible. But for some reason, he's able to make other things move. And he doesn't do it with his fists. He doesn't carry people around and make them move. He's able to make people move through other means, through what we could call invisible means. He makes people move through meaning. Right? He makes people move through influence. Right? These are all invisible things that make visible things move, okay? And that's what we have to understand heaven to be. Because one of the issues we've had, right, is that because of the materialization of a lot of these stories, is that we've forgotten what these terms refer to. And we think of heaven as like just a place you go to be happy after you're dead. That is not what heaven is. That is not what heaven is in the Bible, and that is not what is meant by heaven in our tradition. All right, so it is possible to go to heaven. We'll talk about what that means, though. It means something. It's not arbitrary. And so you can represent it in many ways. You can represent the structure of heaven and earth in many ways. You can represent it the way that I talked about, which is heaven above, the earth below, the way it's talked about in Genesis 1. But another very powerful way to represent it is like this, with heaven as vertical and the earth as horizontal, right? The heaven as a hierarchy of meanings, a hierarchy of things that make other things move below them, and the earth as the potential, the formlessness that will be gathered into form by heaven. And, I could have made a cross, but it would have been too obvious, so I did it this way. I could have. Another way to do it is this way, right? And so you can represent the relationship between heaven and earth as a pyramid, or a mountain is another way of thinking about it. And you just have to think about it phenomenologically, right? To just understand how real this description is, how a mountain represents the relationship between heaven and earth. First of all, just because when you look at it, it's going up into the heavens. I think it's a very simple thing. But if you've gone up a mountain, you will experience a little version of going to heaven. Because what's going to happen when you go up a mountain is you can try it. The first thing to do if you want to experience this going up a mountain is before you go up, put your face on the ground. Lie down on the ground and look around. And what you will see is very particular. You will see very few things. Maybe a few blades of grass. If you're lucky, maybe a bug or something. And as you go up the mountain, those particularities will be gathered into a unified experience. Right? So the higher you go up the mountain, the more multiplicity is gathered into your experience, and the more you have a general view of something. And then when you reach the summit of the mountain, the experience of that, right, is to be on top of the world. Because now you look around and you see the entirety of the extended world gathered into your single perception, right? And so when we have characters in Scripture that go up a mountain, it is not arbitrary in any way. When Moses goes up the mountain to receive the law, which is a pattern that makes other things move, that is what he's doing. When Moses goes up the mountain to receive an architectural plan, which is an invisible relationship of measurements, in order to then build a temple, a tabernacle below, that is what he's doing. He's going up to receive something which makes other things move. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. Now, this is it's not just in the Bible. This is a universal notion. You know, Bishop Barron yesterday talked about Aristotle and his ideas and how Christians brought these ideas into the church to help us understand these images. And so we can talk about actual and potential. This is the manner in which Aristotle talks about it. You have the identity of things, which is not the things, right? It's a name is something which gathers multiplicity into it, like the identity of things, and then the possibilities that they fill when the identity finds its body. We're already going to use that word. And this is not, how can I say this? Like, this is something which was beautifully represented. One of my favorite images of this is, of course, in Dante's comedy, when they reach in the heavens, at some point, Beatrice gives Dante this beautiful image, and she says, order was concreated and constructed in substances, and summit of the world were those wherein the pure act was produced. Pure potentiality held the lowest part, midway bound potentiality with act, such bond that it shall never be undone. And that is the act of creation. It is the binding of the pattern with the potential. Right? It's the marriage of heaven and earth. It's the union of invisible things that make things move, and then, let's say, the multiplicity moving into that union. And we see in the story of creation, we see that. Right? And so, the God in heaven gives a constraint. Right? You can understand this image of heaven as a constraint. Like, if you think of a law as a good way to understand it, what does a law do? It takes behavior and it brings it together towards a purpose, right? It constrains behavior in a direction. So God says, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it according to the various kinds. And so God, it's super interesting, by the way, because sometimes we have this idea that, you know, and I'll be honest with you, Michelangelo is a little bit to blame for this, right? Because Michelangelo shows God like flying around and like making stuff with his hands, you know. But that's not what's represented here. What's represented here is that God gives a very general constraint. And then he tells the earth to generate variation on his constraint. He says, let the earth produce something that fits into this identity, right? And why does he say seed-bearing plants. It's really important to understand, like, why is it not just let the earth generate plants? He's saying, no, let the earth generate seed-bearing plants. Because this structure of heaven and earth, right, is going to reproduce itself at every level of creation. It is the pattern of everything that you can experience, which is that everything has in itself a little heaven and a little earth that's joined together. And the way that it's represented in Genesis is that that will be constantly reiterated. So the plants with the seed, the plants with the pattern inside, right? So the pattern of the plant is in the plant so that the plant can then be a living thing. It can now perpetuate its being. Right? That's how we have to start to think about it. You know, this is one of the biggest difficulties about a lot of the modern scientists is that they just skip over that. Like, they just take it for granted that there are things in the world that perpetuate their own being. Interesting. It's a very powerful idea, right? That the plant has the seed and it acts against chaos, right? So we could say that there are things in the world that fight chaos, right? That are made in a manner that they resist the normal tendency of things to break down and to move towards stasis, and that is life. And what it is the perpetuation of being. And that seed is there. So God says, let the earth produce, and then the land produces vegetation, plants bearing seed according to the kinds, and trees bearing fruit with the seed in it according to their kinds. And so the earth produced variation on the constraint. Okay? And now it's really important to understand, again, that God then selects, right? So God in heaven, right? He sees, he evaluates, and he says, it is good, right? So God selects what is good as the earth generates possibility, as the earth generates variation on the constraint that he gave. Now, in creation, it's very powerful because God says that all things are good as he created them. But we'll later see that the possibility that the earth generates bad is also there, right? And we won't talk about that today in the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, or good and evil. But that is part of the structure, right? But at least for now, we can still see that God evaluates. And so you could understand this, right, as in order for something to be in the constraint that's offered by heaven, right, it has to be, how can I say this? In order for a dog to be a dog, it has to be a dog. I know this really sounds tautological. I know it sounds tautological, but, certain things in our world are taken so much for granted, right, that we forget that there is a type of selection, right, and identification of beings that are made up of a bunch of stuff, right? Dogs are not one thing, folks. Dogs are millions and millions and millions of things, yet nonetheless, we have the capacity to see in them the good that is dog. And we can see, and we can evaluate, and we can judge that. And the thing is we can even say good dog, bad dog. All right. Okay, so now, Dante's quote is so powerful. It's so beautiful. He says, pure potentiality had the lowest part, midway bound potentiality with act such bond that it will never be unbound. Like, what is he talking about when he talks about this midway point that bounds potentiality with act in a bond that shall never be unbound? What he's talking about is he's talking about the incarnation. Right? That's what he's talking about. He's talking about the place where the perfect unity of the invisible patterns that legislate reality and the potentiality of the earth are held together. Now, he is talking about the incarnation, but the incarnation is already prefigured in the creation of man. Right, and this is something that Bishop Barron beautifully brought up yesterday. So let's go back and understand the pattern again, right? So you have above, you have spirit, you have light, you have these lights that move in the heavens in a regular fashion, right? And that they're like a clock, like this giant clock made of lights in the heaven, which regulates our experience of reality. Regulates it by day and night, regulates it by predicting the seasons, it regulates our experience. That's what's this beautiful regular clock that's moving up in the heavens. And then down here, we have much less regular patterns, right? We have more chaotic things going on, right? Things are less clear and less precise as what we see in the heavens. So this idea, right, like I said, once you come back into our human experience, you can totally understand why these images are used to talk about these processes, okay? So God gathers the dust of the ground. Now, this is a question that nobody asked, and the question is, what is dust? Exactly. Dust is a bunch of things that have nothing to do with each other, right? It's a bunch of stuff that is actually unrelated to each other. And in our experience, even, dust is usually residues of other beings. I don't know if that's what's being, let's say, brought about here, but like this idea that it's fragments, it's broken bits of things that no longer have identity. And so God takes that stuff and he gathers it together, and then he puts heaven inside, right? And that's the human, right? And so the human does exactly that. It's like it's not that we have to brag that oh, now the human is joining heaven and earth. There are no other beings that we know of that are capable of perceiving the patterns and understanding how those patterns apply to the world. But even more than that, because God does that, brings multiplicity into one, puts heaven inside, and then says to the man, all right, now you continue what I did. And he says, now you go and you name the animals. Right? And that's what naming is. Naming is recognizing, and in the case of Adam, it's a synergistic thing, right? He's not creating per se, but he is recognizing in a way that he participates in the unity of the beings that he is recognizing and he is naming. And I know this sounds weird, but think about even the way we name animals today, right? Think about breeds of dogs, right? Why do we have names for breeds of dogs? All those dogs can reproduce between themselves. But nonetheless, we have these names for breeds of dogs. And why do we? We have like certain limits of qualities that we recognize in dogs that makes us differentiate them and give them names. But those limits are totally fluid, right? It's like, why is it that we have this breed, and then we have a mutt? It's like, why isn't it just another breed, right? Like, why are not all these intermediaries named? It's because that's just not how it works, right? So the human being participates in identification, categorization, through our capacity to know what is relevant, right, and what coheres together towards identity and recognizing it, right? It's like this intuition that we have. We don't, when you see the different breeds of dogs, you just intuitively know that they're different things, although they probably have more in common than they have different. But you can see the difference, and you're able to name the difference. And so some of the saints have talked about this very beautifully. One of my favorite saints, my go-to saint, is St. Maximus the Confessor. And he talks about this. I want to read you a quote from him. He talks about man, and he says, "He was brought into being as an all-containing workshop, binding all together in himself. As such, he has also been given the power of unification, thanks to his proper relationship to his own different parts," right? So the human gathers his thoughts, gathers his being into one. Man was further brought into being as the last of God's creatures because he was supposed to be a natural link between all creation, mediating between the extremes through the elements of his own nature. And so the reason why Adam is created last is because he gathers all things into himself, right? And that sounds weird to us, right? Because oh, come on, we don't gather all things in ourselves. But the reality is that we do, because we are the beings that are capable of noticing and realizing intelligibility in the world. And so when we see a quasar and we name it and we recognize its qualities, we are gathering it into man, right? We are making it part of what man is, right? And so that is how the world actually functions. And so that's why St. Maximus talks about man as the microcosm, right? So the man is a little universe because he gathers all these things into him. But he goes even further, and he says that the cosmos is macroanthropos, which means that the cosmos is man writ large. And this is hard for modern people to think that way, but there is no cosmos that is not intelligible. Whatever is not intelligible cannot exist. I know this is going to sound weird. Cannot exist in the sense that we have no other way of engaging with the world and of understanding it, of measuring it, then through. There is no world outside of human consciousness. Okay? Because intelligibility is a necessary component for you to even recognize that there's a world. For you to even recognize, like when people use the word universe, do you know how crazy that word is? The everything. Like we have a name for everything. We have a name for all the things, and we say one. We have a one of all things. It's astounding that we have words for these things, But that is actually how it functions, because the human provides, not just provides, but participates and provides the capacity for unity to appear in reality, okay? And this is true, right? And the church fathers have these beautiful language about how the human person is made. And they'll say that you have inside you the same structure. And so Saint Isaac the Syrian says, apply yourself to entering your interior chamber, and you will see the celestial chamber. For it is one and the same door open to the contemplation of both. The ladder of this kingdom is hidden inside you, in your soul. And so your soul, remember again what Bishop Barron told us yesterday, your soul is not a floaty ghost that, exists somewhere inside you, right? The soul is the organizing pattern of you, And if you enter into yourself, you will notice that you are made in the same way as the entire cosmos, with a unifying principle and a multiplying principle, right? That you have all this multiplicity, all your thoughts, all your feelings, all these things, all these things that you have to gather into one, and that is a direct image of how all of reality functions. Multiplicity moving into pattern, moving into constraint, moving into name, okay? And then some of the saints go even further, and he, like St. Gregory of Palamas has this great saying, he says, when God's grace does not dwell in man, then the demons make a nest at the bottom of man's heart, like real snakes, and they never permit the heart of man to desire the good. And so think about all the things that I've been telling you about, right? And so the grace of God coming down from heaven, right? The influence of heaven, think about it that way. There's the influence of heaven, which, and if you do not see or do not attach yourself or do not grasp that grace, that influence of heaven, then you become, let's say, a victim of the snakes and all the multiplicity that is down here, and it makes it impossible to see the good, right? And so everybody has had that experience, and everybody has seen people who have had that experience that lose themselves in their desires and are blind, right? They're no longer able to see that which provides true unity. But that structure, right, of our interior chamber, when St. Paul says that the body is the temple, right? That's what he's talking about. The temple in the Old Testament is exactly this. The tabernacle, the temple, think of the way that the tabernacle is made. It's made exactly in this way. There is a hierarchy in the tabernacle of multiplicity. So there's a bunch of people in the court. There are a few priests in the holy place. And then there's one priest that goes into the Holy of Holies. You've got a nice little pyramid. And then in that space, the influence of heaven descends, right? The glory of God descends in that space, and that gives the identity for Israel. And so now the 12 tribes are gathered around the tabernacle in an orderly manner, and their unity is in the tabernacle. Because why don't the tribes just always fight amongst themselves? Why do they even see themselves as one? There has to be something which provides the unity for us to be able to recognize that, okay? And we simply cannot avoid it, right? And St. Maximus goes very far, and he says, the entire cosmos consisting of visible and invisible things, right? And remember now, visible and invisible doesn't mean that you just don't see it. Invisible means that which makes visible things move, right? And visible means the things that are moved by the invisible patterns, okay? So he says, the entire cosmos consisting of the visible and invisible is man. And man consisting of body and soul is cosmos. For the intelligible things participate to the substance of the soul, as the soul has the same reason as the intelligible ones, right? So the soul is the intelligibility of the body, just as the intelligibilities of the world act on the particularities of reality. And so man continues this work of uniting heaven and earth. And in man, there is also that division, which is man and woman, male and female. When the Genesis account ends and said God created man, male and female, he is repeating the pattern of heaven and earth, right? And so this is why all the images that are used by St. Paul, right, to talk about this question are related to the creation narrative at the beginning. So we can understand, and so it's like, it's so hard because we're so taken up by politics, but like if we understand male and female, right, just in its function as generating function, okay? Not in all the other aspects that make us who we are, just that function. In the experience of the world, we have the same image that we see in Genesis, which is that the man provides a seed and the woman provides the body, right? The woman generates the variability on the seed that is provided by man. And that is how the ancients understood it. And that's how, you could say, that is how the structure functions all through the New Testament. And that's why the church is described also as a body. All right, so I'm running out of time. But when St. Paul talks about this relationship between the head and the body, this is what he's talking about. Jesus went up into heaven, became the head of the church, became the one that unites the body, became the one that provides the pattern of being that we follow in order to be the body, right? So when we say Jesus ascended into heaven, we have to be careful. Like the image of him going up is totally fine, right? But Jesus is not, in a cloud somewhere, like he's not on the moon, he's not like on the space station or wherever, right? Jesus ascended the hierarchy of being and has become the principle which generates a body that is held together in cohesion. And so that's why the body is represented even in the New Testament as a bride, as feminine, right? As the feminine which is united with its groom in order for that union of heaven and earth to happen, right? And so the sexual union is a union of heaven and earth at the level that it exists, because it does exactly what the union of heaven and earth does at every other level, okay? And of course it has corollaries. It's not just the physical act, but everything about the constitution of the family and then the multiplication of the children that also are like the body that is held together in the unity that the family provides. I'm going to skip a few things here. There's so many things I could have said. All right, let me just, so the way to understand it, very simple, like if we want to bring it all together, is that when we look at the relationship between the head and the body, the relationship towards the head is the relationship towards unity, the gathering of the multiplicity into a single point, a purpose, a reason, a name. You can put all the invisible things you want there, all the things that manage other things. That is what heaven does, and that is what the head does in the image of the relationship between the head and the body. And then the body is the tendency towards multiplicity. It is the expression of unity in its variability, right? It's the expression of that purpose in all its possible iterations. And they're indefinite, right? There's an indefinite amount of dogs. Like there's no limit to how many possible dogs there are, but they are all bound by one quality, certain qualities that we see moving into one so that we can recognize the cohesion of that category, right? But that's true at every single level. And at the end of the whole story, the Bible presents us the cosmic image of this, right? And in the image of the heavenly Jerusalem, we see the finality of the structure that is set up in Genesis 1 and comes together in the full unity of the cosmic head and the cosmic body. And the way that it's described is very powerful. So when you look at it now, you can see, right, just that image of Christ above, the Son of Man, the one who ascends into heaven, that he is the light of the city, that he is above the city and gives meaning, gives light to the city. We don't need the sun anymore. And now the city is this perfect square, and all the kings of the earth come and they offer their multiplicity, they offer their variation up to the head, which is the Son of Man. And so the image of the heavenly Jerusalem is the final image of how identity and multiplicity functions. It's a cosmic vision, but it applies at every level of everything that you recognize as having identity. Everything you can recognize as having identity is a little temple with a little spark of God hidden somewhere inside, bringing the multiplicity together. And that is why, once we understand that, like once we see that, we have to realize that it's not that God is not there. It's not that God is not present in our life, and it's that we are so blind. Like we have lost our capacity to experience the magic of that. Right? The magic of how it is through our capacity in the image of God of seeing things and grasping their unity. All those experiences, like whether it's grabbing a glass or anything that you do is actually a little mystical experience. It's a little one. But, it can lead you up the ladder, as St. Isaac says, if you are attentive to it and you find joy and you participate in it fully. So hopefully this was useful to you, and thank you for your time.